The loneliest people are not the ones who sit by themselves. They are the ones nobody notices are sitting alone. I first saw her on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The cafe sat on the corner of Lexington Avenue and 47th Street, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. Most people walked past without remembering it existed. I preferred it that way. It was one of the few places in Manhattan where nobody bothered me. At least, that was true until I noticed her. Every day at exactly 12:15 p.m., she walked through the front door. Every day she ordered the same lunch. Turkey sandwich, black coffee, apple slices, nothing more. Then she carried her tray to table 12 near the window and sat alone. The first day I noticed it, I thought nothing of it. The second day I became curious. By the fifth day, I found myself looking toward the door before she even arrived. My name is Dominic Russo. Most people knew my name before they met me. Some feared it. Others respected it. Very few treated me like an ordinary man. Yet somehow I spent more time thinking about a woman sitting alone at lunch than I did about most of the people in my own life. Outside, yellow taxis splashed through puddles. Rain rolled down the cafe windows in silver lines. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the room. Hannah Brooks entered right on schedule. Same dark green coat. Same leather satchel. Same quiet expression. She nodded politely to the cashier, picked up her order, and headed toward table 12. Alone. Always alone. Nobody waved at her. Nobody joined her. Nobody pulled out the empty chair across from her. It remained untouched every day. That was the part that stayed with me. The empty chair. Manhattan was a city packed with millions of people. Yet somehow that chair never had an owner. I sat across the room pretending to read financial reports while secretly watching her. Not in a strange way. Not because she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was attractive, certainly. Blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Clear blue eyes. Soft features. But that was not why I noticed her. I noticed her because she seemed invisible. People brushed past her without looking. Employees handed her food without conversation. Customers filled every surrounding table. Nobody ever stopped. Nobody ever stayed. One afternoon, a group of coworkers entered together. They laughed loudly and pushed tables together near the center of the cafe. Hannah looked up briefly. Just briefly. Then she returned to her lunch. The moment lasted less than 2 seconds. Most people would have missed it. I did not. There was something in her eyes. Not jealousy. Not sadness. Something quieter. Acceptance. As if she had already made peace with being forgotten. That realization bothered me more than it should have. The next day I arrived early. Table 12 sat empty beside the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass. The city moved outside in its usual rush. At exactly 12:15 p.m., Hannah walked through the door again. Same lunch. Same coffee. Same table. Same empty chair. I watched her open a paperback novel and begin reading while she ate. Completely alone. Completely comfortable. Or at least she wanted the world to think she was. For the first time in weeks, I ignored the messages on my phone. I ignored the meetings waiting for me downtown. Instead, I found myself staring at table 12 and asking a question I could not answer. Why did a woman like Hannah Brooks always eat alone? Patterns reveal things people try to hide. That was what kept bothering me. Every afternoon, Hannah Brooks followed the same routine with the precision of a train schedule. She arrived at 12:15 p.m. She ordered the same lunch. She sat at the same table. She opened a book. Then she left exactly 40 minutes later. The routine never changed. First, I thought it was discipline. Then I started wondering if it was something else. The following Monday, Manhattan woke beneath a clear blue sky. Sunlight reflected off glass towers and turned the city into a field of gold. I arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early. Not because I planned to speak to Hannah. At least that was what I told myself. I simply wanted coffee. That was the excuse. Yet somehow I found myself sitting where I could see table 12 without turning my head. The chair across from her sat empty. It always did. Exactly 12:15 p.m. the door opened. Hannah stepped inside carrying her familiar leather satchel. She wore a navy coat that day and a cream-colored sweater underneath. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to attract attention. She moved through the crowded room almost unnoticed. A businessman nearly walked into her while checking his phone. A pair of college students cut in front of her without realizing it. Hannah never reacted. She simply continued forward. It was as if she had learned how to move through the world without expecting anyone to see her. That thought stayed with me. While she ate, I watched the room instead of watching her. That was when I noticed something strange. People sat alone all the time. Manhattan was full of solitary lunches. Yet loneliness looked different. The difference was not the empty seat. It was the absence of expectation. Most people glanced toward the door occasionally. They checked messages. They looked around. Somewhere inside them was the possibility that someone might arrive. Hannah never looked up. Not once. It was as if she already knew nobody was coming. Tuesday looked exactly the same. So did Wednesday. By Thursday, I found myself anticipating her arrival more than some of my own meetings. My assistant called 3 times that afternoon. I ignored every call. Instead, I sat with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands while Hannah read another novel beside the window. She smiled once while reading. A real smile. Small and private. Whatever was happening inside those pages seemed more important than the entire room around her. For some reason that made me happy. Then Friday arrived. For the first time since I started paying attention, table 12 remained empty. I looked at the clock. 12:15 p.m. Nothing. 12:20 p.m. Still nothing. By 12:30 p.m., the coffee no longer tasted right. The cafe felt different. Larger somehow. The empty chair suddenly seemed louder than the conversations around it. Ridiculous. I barely knew her name. Yet I found myself staring at the door every few minutes. At 12:37 p.m., Hannah finally appeared. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. Her shoulders slumped beneath her coat. She ordered her usual lunch and walked to the table. No book today. No smile either. She simply stared out the window while absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. For the first time, I realized something important. Hannah was not just alone. She was carrying something heavy. And the more I watched her sit silently beside that window, the more I wanted to know what it was. The hardest stories to uncover are the ones nobody is trying to tell. After that Friday afternoon, I could not stop thinking about Hannah's face. For weeks she had looked quiet, reserved, maybe even content in her solitude. But that day had been different. Something weighed on her. Something heavy enough to silence even the small smiles she usually shared with the pages of her books. The following Monday arrived cold and windy. Gray clouds drifted over Manhattan like a blanket stretched across the sky. I arrived at the cafe earlier than usual and took my familiar seat. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the room. Dishes clinked softly behind the counter. Outside, people hurried past with collars raised against the wind. At exactly 12:15 p.m., Hannah walked through the door. Right on schedule. Yet somehow she seemed even smaller than before. Not physically. Emotionally. As if she were carrying a burden nobody else could see. She ordered her lunch and sat at table 12. The empty chair remained untouched. 40 minutes later she left. The next day the pattern repeated. Then Wednesday. Then Thursday. The routine never changed. Yet the more I watched, the more details I noticed. She never spoke to anyone except the cashier. She never received phone calls. Her phone often remained face down beside her tray. She never checked social media. Never seemed distracted by messages. Most people in New York spent half their lives staring at screens. Hannah looked as though she expected nobody to contact her. That realization bothered me more than I cared to admit. One afternoon, curiosity finally overcame restraint. The cafe owner knew me well enough to exchange occasional conversation. While Hannah sat reading near the window, I casually asked about her. Table 12, the owner said immediately. Nice woman. You know her. Only a little. He wiped down the counter. She has been coming here for almost 2 years. 2 years. The number surprised me. Always alone? The owner nodded. Every day. Something tightened in my chest. 2 years. 700 lunches. 700 empty chairs. The owner lowered his voice slightly. I heard she works at the city library a few blocks away. That was all he knew. Yet somehow it felt like the first piece of a puzzle. A few days later, I found myself walking past the library during lunch hour. The building stood quietly between office towers. Large stone columns framed the entrance. Through the windows, I spotted Hannah organizing books behind a desk. She moved through the rows with the same calm precision she carried into the cafe every afternoon. A young child approached her with a question. Hannah immediately knelt beside him and helped him find a book. The boy smiled. Hannah smiled back. A real smile. Warm and genuine. Then she returned to work. I stood outside longer than I should have. Watching. Observing. Trying to understand. The strange thing was that Hannah clearly knew how to connect with people. She was kind, patient, gentle. Children trusted her instantly. Elderly visitors stopped to chat with her. Yet somehow, when her workday ended, she always returned to a life that seemed completely empty. That Friday, I arrived at the cafe just before noon. Hannah was already there. For the first time ever. No book. No lunch. She simply sat staring out the window. The chair across from her remained empty as always. But there was something else this time. A folded photograph resting beside her coffee. She looked down at it once. Then quickly turned it face down. The sadness in her eyes lasted only a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. And as I watched her quietly brush her fingertips across the edge of that photograph, I realized I had been wrong about one thing. Hannah Brooks was not hiding from the world. She was holding on to something she could not bear to let go. Sometimes a single smile can tell you more than 1,000 words. The following Monday, I saw the photograph again. Hannah arrived. At 12:15 p.m. as always. Same table. Same lunch. Same empty chair. But this time, the photograph remained beside her coffee instead of hidden inside her bag. I sat across the cafe pretending to review documents while watching her trace the edge of the picture with her thumb. The gesture was small, careful, familiar, like something she had done countless times before. For nearly 20 minutes, she stared out the window without turning a page of her book. Eventually, she folded the photograph and slipped it back into her satchel. Yet the sadness remained. By then, curiosity had evolved into something else. Concern. I wanted to know why a woman who seemed so kind carried so much loneliness. The answer arrived unexpectedly 3 days later. A winter storm rolled through Manhattan that afternoon. Snow drifted past the cafe windows. The room filled with people escaping the cold. Every table was occupied except one. The chair across from Hannah remained empty. As usual, I watched customers search for seats. Several glanced toward her table. None approached. Hannah seemed not to notice. Or perhaps she was simply used to it. Then a sudden gust of wind pushed through the front door as a delivery worker entered carrying a stack of packages. One box slipped from his hands. Papers scattered across the floor. Several customers looked up briefly before returning to their meals. Hannah stood immediately. She crossed the room without hesitation and helped gather every sheet. The delivery worker looked embarrassed. Hannah smiled and assured him everything was fine. 5 minutes later, she returned to her seat. Nobody applauded. Nobody acknowledged what she had done. She did not seem to expect them to. That moment stayed with me. So did dozens of others over the following week. Hannah held doors open for strangers. Helped elderly customers carry trays. Picked up dropped napkins. Offered kindness so naturally it seemed woven into her personality. Yet when lunchtime ended, she always packed her belongings and walked away alone. One Friday afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual and chose a table near the counter. Hannah entered exactly on time. As she approached the register, the cashier greeted her warmly. "Big day tomorrow?" he asked. Hannah smiled politely. "Not really. I thought you always visit your parents this weekend." The smile faded slightly. Only slightly. Most people would never have noticed. "I did. I still do," she answered quietly. After collecting her lunch, she returned to table 12. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet suddenly pieces began fitting together. The photograph. The sadness. The way she stared out windows. The way she carried loneliness like an old companion. Later that afternoon, after Hannah left, I approached the counter. "The woman who sits near the window," I said casually. The cashier smiled. "Hannah? Sweetest person you will ever meet." He hesitated. Life has not been easy for her. I waited. She lost both parents a few years ago. Carried most of it by herself. The words settled heavily inside me. Suddenly everything made sense. The photograph. The empty chair. The silence. Hannah was not waiting for someone to arrive. She was remembering people who never could. As snow continued falling beyond the glass, I looked toward table 12. The chair across from it remained empty. For the first time I understood why. And for the first time I wondered what would happen if someone finally sat there. Some chairs remain empty because nobody notices them. Others remain empty because nobody is brave enough to sit down. After learning about Hannah's parents, I could not stop thinking about her. The knowledge changed everything. Every lunch. Every quiet glance out the window. Every moment spent staring at that folded photograph. What once looked like solitude now felt like grief. And grief has a way of making even crowded rooms feel empty. For the next several days I watched the same routine unfold. Hannah arrived at 12:15 p.m. She ordered her lunch. She sat at table 12. The chair across from her remained untouched. Yet something inside me had changed. Curiosity was no longer enough. I wanted to know the woman behind the routine. The woman who spent her days helping strangers while carrying her own sadness in silence. The opportunity came unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. A cold rain tapped against the cafe windows. The lunch crowd was larger than usual. Nearly every table was occupied. I arrived late and found only one empty seat available. The chair across from Hannah. I stood there for several seconds holding my coffee. My pulse felt strangely unsteady. Ridiculous. I had negotiated deals worth millions of dollars without hesitation. Yet asking a woman if I could share her table suddenly seemed impossible. Finally, before I could talk myself out of it, I walked over. Hannah looked up from her book. Surprise flickered across her face. "Is this seat taken?" I asked. She glanced at the empty chair. Then back at me. For one terrifying second I thought she might refuse. Instead she smiled politely. "No." I sat down. The moment felt far more significant than it should have. Outside, rain streaked the windows. Inside, the cafe buzzed with conversation. Yet somehow everything felt quieter. "I see you here a lot," I said. Hannah laughed softly. I was about to say the same thing. The sound immediately eased some of the tension. "Then I guess we have both been caught." "Looks that way." For the next few minutes we talked about simple things. The weather. The coffee. The books she liked to read. Nothing personal. Nothing complicated. Yet conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Hannah possessed the kind of warmth that made people feel comfortable without trying. More than once I caught myself smiling. A rare occurrence these days. When lunch ended, Hannah gathered her belongings. "It was nice talking to you," she said. "You too." Then she left. Just like that. The next afternoon I returned. To my surprise, Hannah looked up when I entered. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. When I approached table 12, she closed her book. "Back again?" she asked. "The coffee keeps bringing me here." "Of course." Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "It has nothing to do with the conversation." "Absolutely not." She laughed. This time the smile reached her eyes. Over the following weeks, a quiet friendship began to form. Lunch became something I looked forward to. We talked about books, childhood memories, favorite places in New York. Hannah rarely spoke about herself in detail, but little pieces emerged. She loved libraries because they felt peaceful. She visited Central Park early in the morning before crowds arrived. She believed people revealed their true character through small acts of kindness. One afternoon she grew thoughtful. "Can I tell you something strange?" she asked. "Of course." Hannah looked down at her coffee cup. "My biggest fear is being forgotten." The words landed heavily between us. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I realized something that startled me. I understood exactly what she meant. Because despite all my success, despite all the people who knew my name, I had spent years feeling invisible in ways that mattered most. Some truths arrive quietly. Others walk into the room and sit down beside you. The truth about me did both. For nearly 2 months, lunch became the most predictable part of my day. Hannah and I met at table 12 almost every afternoon. Sometimes we talked for 30 minutes. sometimes for only 10. It never seemed to matter. The conversations were simple, yet they stayed with me long after they ended. We discussed books, favorite neighborhoods, childhood memories, and the strange habits people develop when they live alone. Little by little, the empty chair stopped feeling empty. Then one Tuesday everything changed. The morning began normally enough. Manhattan buzzed beneath clear spring skies. Meetings filled my calendar.
Phones rang constantly.
People moved in and out of my office carrying contracts and reports. By noon I was looking forward to lunch more than I cared to admit. At 12:15 p.m., Hannah walked into the cafe. I was already seated. She smiled when she saw me. "You are early today." I could say the same thing. She laughed and sat down. For a few minutes everything felt familiar, comfortable. Then the television mounted above the counter switched to a local business segment. Normally nobody paid attention. This time several customers looked up. A photograph appeared on the screen. My photograph. Hannah noticed it immediately. I saw her eyes move from the television to me, then back again. The smile slowly disappeared. My stomach tightened. The news anchor discussed a major real estate acquisition. My name appeared beneath the image.
Dominique Russo.
Hannah stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she looked at me. Really looked at me. "That is you." It was not a question. Yes. The word felt heavier than it should have. Silence settled between us. Around us coffee machines hissed. Dishes clattered. Customers continued eating. Yet the entire room suddenly felt distant. Hannah lowered her gaze to her coffee. "You never told me. You never asked." The answer sounded weaker than it had in my head. She nodded slowly. "I suppose that is true." For the first time since we met, I did not know what to say. Hannah had always been open with me. Honest. Meanwhile, I had carefully avoided discussing the parts of my life that attracted attention. Not because I wanted to deceive her. Because I wanted one place where my name did not arrive before I did. Finally she looked up again. Her expression was not angry. That would have been easier. Instead she looked uncertain. "People know who you are." "Some people." Hannah gave a small laugh without humor. "Dominic, there are magazine articles about you." I could not argue with that. The conversation never recovered. We finished lunch politely, carefully, like two strangers trying not to offend each other. When Hannah stood to leave, she hesitated. "I need some time to think." The words landed harder than I expected. "I understand." She offered a faint smile. Then she picked up her satchel and walked away. That afternoon, I sat alone at table 12 long after she left. The chair across from me was empty again. The old emptiness. The familiar one. Outside, pedestrians crossed busy intersections while sunlight reflected off glass towers. Life continued exactly as before. Yet something felt different. For months I had worried about why Hannah always sat alone. Now for the first time, I found myself staring at the empty chair, and wondering if I was the reason it might stay that way. You never realize how important a routine is until it disappears. The day after Hannah asked for time to think, I arrived at the cafe anyway. Part of me expected to see her sitting at table 12. Another part already knew better. At 12:15 p.m. the door opened. Several customers entered. None of them were Hannah. I looked down at my coffee, then back toward the entrance. The chair across from me remained empty. By 12:40 p.m., I finally stood and left. The next day was no different, nor the day after that. 3 lunches, 3 empty chairs, 3 afternoons that felt longer than they should have. It was ridiculous. I had spent years building a life filled with obligations, meetings, and responsibilities. Yet somehow a 40-minute lunch conversation had become the part of my day I missed most. Nearly a week later I saw her again. Not at the cafe. At the library. I had been walking past on my way to a meeting when I spotted Hannah through the front windows. She was speaking with another woman near the circulation desk. There was a folder in her hands. A large one. The kind people carry when they are making important decisions. I told myself to keep walking. Instead, I found myself slowing down. Hannah looked different. Not unhappy. Just thoughtful. As though she were standing at a crossroads only she could see. The answer arrived the following afternoon when she finally returned to table 12. Relief hit me before I could stop it. Hannah smiled when she saw me, but the smile seemed fragile. I was beginning to think you had abandoned this place, I said. She laughed softly. I almost did. Something in her tone immediately caught my attention. We sat in silence for a few moments. Outside, spring sunlight washed across the sidewalks. People filled the streets. Life moved forward as usual. Yet I could feel a conversation approaching. Finally, Hannah took a slow breath. I received a job offer. The words landed harder than I expected. Congratulations. I meant it. Mostly. She looked down at her coffee. It is in Boston. The city suddenly felt very quiet. Boston. More than 200 miles away. Far enough to turn lunch into a memory. Far enough to make table 12 empty again. That is a great opportunity, I said carefully. Hannah nodded. Everyone keeps telling me that. And what do you think? She stared toward the window. I do not. No. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she smiled sadly. Maybe a new city would be good for me. I understood what she meant. New places carry the promise of becoming someone different, of leaving old grief behind. Yet something about the idea unsettled me. Over the next 2 weeks, the possibility of her leaving hung over every conversation. We still met for lunch. We still talked about books and life and the strange people who wandered through New York every day. But now there was a clock quietly ticking beneath every moment. One afternoon after Hannah left, I remained seated long after my coffee had gone cold. The chair across from me sat empty once more. I stared at it and finally admitted something I had been avoiding for months. When I first noticed Hannah, I thought I was curious about her loneliness. The truth was much simpler. Somewhere along the way, she had become part of my life. And for the first time in years, the thought of losing someone frightened me more than being alone ever had. There comes a moment when you stop asking whether someone matters to you and start asking what your life would look like without them. I reached that moment on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Hannah sat across from me at table 12, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. The job offer in Boston had become a quiet presence between us. Neither of us mentioned it immediately anymore. We did not need to. It sat there in every pause, in every glance, in every conversation that ended a little too soon. Outside, spring rain painted the windows with silver streaks. Pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. Inside, the cafe smelled of coffee and warm bread. The same cafe, the same table. Yet everything felt different now. They want an answer by Friday, Hannah said finally. I nodded. That is soon. Very soon. She stared toward the window. Everyone thinks I should go. I wanted to tell her not to. The words rose instantly, then disappeared. Because if Hannah stayed, it had to be her choice, not mine. What do you want? I asked. She smiled faintly. That would be easier if I knew. We sat quietly after that. The silence felt familiar now. Comfortable. The kind that only exists between people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. Eventually Hannah looked at me. Can I ask you something? Anything. Her expression softened. Why did you start talking to me? The question caught me off guard. For months I had prepared myself for countless conversations. Somehow I had never prepared for that one. I looked down at my coffee, then back at her. Do you remember the first time we met? She laughed softly. You mean the day you finally sat in that chair? I smiled. Before that. Hannah looked confused. We had never spoken. Exactly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Waiting. Curious. I took a slow breath. Every day I came here and saw you sitting alone. Hannah immediately looked away. Not embarrassed. Uncomfortable. As if loneliness were something she preferred not to discuss. Most people probably noticed that, she said. No. I shook my head. Most people saw a woman eating lunch. I noticed the chair. Her eyes returned to mine. The chair. Nobody ever sat there. The words came easier now. Day after day. Week after week. Everyone passed by. Nobody stopped. Hannah remained silent. I continued. At first I was curious. Then I started paying attention. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The cafe seemed to disappear around us. And what did you see? She asked quietly. I smiled. Someone who always helped other people. Someone who remembered strangers' names. Someone who listened when nobody else did. Hannah lowered her gaze. That is not what I meant. I knew. I saw someone lonely. Her eyes glistened slightly. Not with sadness. Recognition. You felt sorry for me? No. I answered immediately. I recognized you. That seemed to surprise her. I leaned back in my chair. People know my name. They know my businesses. They know things about my life. I paused. But very few people actually see me. Hannah stared at me, completely still. You were not the only lonely person sitting in this cafe. The words settled between us. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then slowly, very slowly, Hannah smiled. It was not the polite smile she gave strangers. Not the careful smile she used when hiding pain. This one was different. Honest. Warm. And as I looked at her across table 12, I realized something I had been avoiding for far too long. I had not been watching Hannah because she was alone. I had been watching because she was the first person who made me feel less alone too. Life rarely changes all at once. Most of the time it changes through small decisions that seem insignificant in the moment. Friday arrived beneath a bright spring sky. The city felt alive. Sunlight reflected from skyscraper windows. Traffic moved steadily through Manhattan. People hurried toward places that seemed important. Yet all I could think about was one decision being made at table 12. Hannah arrived exactly at 12:15 p.m. Some habits never changed. She carried her usual satchel and wore the soft blue sweater I had seen dozens of times before. But today there was something different in her expression. Quiet certainty. As though a question that had followed her for weeks finally had an answer. When she sat down across from me, neither of us mentioned Boston immediately. We talked about a book she had recently finished. We talked about a new exhibit opening at the library. We talked about everything except the thing sitting between us. Finally, Hannah smiled and shook her head. We are both avoiding it. I laughed. Probably. She took a slow breath. Then she reached into her satchel and removed an envelope. The same envelope I had seen her carrying for days. The job offer. For a moment she simply looked at it. Then she placed it on the table. I made my decision. My heart felt heavier than it should have. And Hannah looked toward the window. Sunlight spilled across the sidewalk outside. People passed by without realizing how important this moment felt to me. Then she turned back toward me. I turned it down.
Ist daher.
You did. She nodded. I spent weeks asking myself whether I wanted a new city. Her smile softened. Then I realized what I really wanted was a new chapter. I remained silent, waiting. Those are not always the same thing. The words settled gently between us. For the first time in weeks, the weight I had been carrying seemed to disappear. Hannah laughed quietly when she saw my expression. You look relieved. I am trying very hard not to. You are failing. That made both of us laugh. The sound felt warm. Familiar. Honest. The kind of laughter that only exists when people stop pretending. We remained at the cafe longer than usual that afternoon. Long enough for the lunch crowd to disappear. Long enough for fresh pots of coffee to be brewed. Long enough for sunlight to shift across the floor. At one point, Hannah reached into her satchel again. This time she removed the photograph I had seen months earlier. She slid it across the table. It showed her standing between her parents years ago. All three smiling. All three happy. I looked at the picture carefully before handing it back. They seem wonderful. Hannah smiled. They were. She glanced at the empty chair beside us, then back at me. For a long time, I thought losing people meant I would always be alone. Her voice remained calm. I was wrong. Neither of us said anything after that. We did not need to. Some truths speak loudly enough on their own. A year later, table 12 still stood beside the window. The cafe looked exactly the same. The smell of coffee still drifted through the room. Sunlight still filled the space every afternoon. Customers still came and went. Yet one thing had changed. The chair across from Hannah was no longer empty. Most days I was sitting there. And sometimes when I looked around at the crowded cafe, I remembered the woman who once spent every lunch alone. Then I remembered something even more important. The people who change our lives are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are simply the ones we choose to notice. And sometimes, all it takes to save two lonely people is one empty chair that finally finds someone willing to sit in it.